The footage wasn't remarkable at first glance. A woman, blonde, athletically built, steps out of a white Subaru Outback. She closes the door, adjusts the strap of her gym bag, and walks briskly toward the tree-lined trail. The timestamp reads August 5th, 2023, 6:07 p.m. That was the last time anyone saw Rachel Morin alive. She had parked at the William Street trailhead of the Ma and Pa Heritage Trail in Bel Air, Maryland. This wasn't a remote forest or isolated hiking path. It was a suburban walking trail, paved in parts, open to the public, well-traveled even in the evenings. But Rachel didn't come back. Her car remained locked where she left it. No one noticed anything unusual. No one heard a scream. There were no calls to 911, no reports of suspicious activity. She simply vanished into a stretch of woods less than 2 miles long in daylight on a Saturday evening. By 11:23 p.m., her boyfriend, Richard Tobin, made the first official missing persons report. According to his statement to Harford County deputies, he hadn't heard from Rachel since late afternoon. He had texted. He had waited. Then he drove to the trailhead. He found her car untouched. Her phone wasn't answering. The silence, he said, felt off. Deputies arrived before midnight. There was no blood, no purse on the ground, no signs of a struggle. Rachel was a grown woman. There were no immediate grounds for declaring foul play. The report was filed as a missing person with unusual circumstances. Search units were mobilized but limited due to darkness. No public alert was issued. Not yet. By morning, it became clear this wasn't just a delay or miscommunication. Her family began calling friends. Her sister posted online. Civilian searchers gathered around the trail entrance by mid-morning, forming informal patrols. No one said it aloud, but most of them already sensed the outcome. At 1:07 p.m. on August 6th, a man walking along the trail near Edgewood Road noticed something unnatural, a pale shape in the shadows beneath a culvert just off the path. He didn't investigate. He called 911. When deputies returned to the scene, they found Rachel's body partially concealed inside the concrete drain pipe. She was nude from the waist down. Blood pooled around her head. Her upper body was twisted in a way that suggested she'd been dragged. Her limbs bore scrape marks. Her hair was matted with blood. A rock with visible biological material lay nearby. She had not wandered off the trail. She had not overdosed. She had not tripped and fallen. This was deliberate, violent, and concealed. It was now a homicide. The body was officially identified within the hour. A perimeter was established and the area was locked down. Officers began knocking on doors along the back edges of the trail. Drones were used to scan the tree line. Nothing else was found. What stood out most to the investigators wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. There was no sign of a purse, no shoes, no phone. There were no drag marks leading into the woods from the trail itself. Just faint impressions heading toward the drain, consistent with someone being moved post-mortem. The attack hadn't occurred far from the trail. It had occurred in it, or just beside it. Yet no one had heard a thing. By 4 p.m., the Harford County Sheriff's Office released a brief public statement. Rachel Morin's death was being investigated as a homicide. The autopsy report, completed early the next day, was clinical and brutal. Blunt force trauma to the skull, multiple fractures consistent with a heavy object used in rapid succession. Sexual assault confirmed by evidence of internal trauma. DNA was recovered. Time of death was estimated between 6:45 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. the night before. The timeline was narrow. Rachel entered the trail at 6:07 p.m. Based on gait analysis from the footage and her known walking pace, she would have reached the area near the culvert between 6:40 and 6:50. Her estimated time of death matched the expected time she would have arrived at that spot. Whoever killed her likely knew the area, or had watched her enter the trail alone. The presence of DNA was the first real lead. It was uploaded into CODIS immediately. The database search returned no matches. The DNA did not belong to anyone previously arrested in Maryland, or anywhere in the U.S., at least not under the same identity. That raised new questions. In parallel, detectives began vetting every person close to Rachel. Richard Tobin, her boyfriend, was brought in for questioning. His phone records were clean. Location data showed he had been at home during the critical hours. His timeline of texts and unanswered calls matched the digital footprint. He was not ruled out immediately, but the focus was shifting elsewhere. Detectives canvassed local trail users. Some had seen a man jogging in the opposite direction around 7 p.m., medium build, dark hoodie, didn't look out of place. Others recalled nothing. There were no surveillance cameras along the trail itself. A few businesses on nearby streets provided footage, but nothing conclusive. The man in the hoodie, if he existed, was now a ghost. Internally, the team labeled the suspect a random opportunistic offender. That wasn't optimism. It was code for worst-case scenario. A stranger with no link to the victim, no record, no trail. Hard to find, harder to stop. Within 48 hours, Harford County had gone from a quiet suburb to a crime scene that rattled law enforcement far beyond its borders. The culvert where Rachel Morin's body was found wasn't deep, no more than 4 feet high. A standard concrete storm drain used to redirect runoff under the trail. But once crime scene techs descended into it, what they documented shifted the tone of the case immediately. This wasn't an opportunistic mugging or a fight gone wrong. The scene showed calculated brutality. The immediate focus was the condition of Rachel's body. Her upper torso had been twisted against the side of the pipe, her head partially submerged in shallow water. The impact trauma to the skull was severe, later confirmed to have crushed the occipital bone. Defensive wounds on her forearms showed she had fought back, but not for long. Trace elements of gravel embedded in the abrasions confirmed that she'd been dragged from a different location, likely no more than 20 feet before being pushed into the culvert. No footwear, no socks. The soles of her feet were torn, indicating she may have tried to flee barefoot. The medical examiner confirmed what the positioning had already implied. This was a targeted, close-range assault. The sexual assault was confirmed through trauma evidence and biological material. Semen was recovered and DNA was extracted. It was submitted immediately to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. The result came back within hours. No match. That result presented a problem. The DNA profile indicated a male of likely Central American descent, but without a prior U.S. arrest, his genetic fingerprint existed in no law enforcement database. It also eliminated immediate suspicion toward Rachel's known acquaintances, boyfriend, ex-husband, co-workers. They were cleared through voluntary swabs and matched alibis. The killer, it now appeared, was not someone Rachel knew. Evidence technicians worked in overlapping shifts over 36 hours to process the immediate area. Luminol testing was inconclusive due to water flow. Soil impressions near the pipe were analyzed but provided no usable tread patterns. However, a single partial print, likely from a running shoe, was recovered on the incline leading down to the culvert. It was entered into the National Footwear Database, but with no make or model determined, it sat flagged with no active hits. The theory forming behind the scenes was troubling. The assailant had either stalked Rachel or waited for an opportunity. He struck with speed and force, likely used a heavy object from the trail itself, most probably the bloodied rock recovered near the body. Then he disposed of her quickly in a location just off the main path, but concealed enough that she wouldn't be spotted unless someone was looking. The silence of the trail now became its most dangerous trait. By Monday morning, the sheriff's office had deployed patrols along all entry points of the Ma and Pa Trail. Temporary signage warned users of active police investigation. Foot traffic dropped sharply. Crime scene tape remained in place for 3 full days. Local media picked up the case first, labeling it a possible trail slaying. Regional outlets followed, and soon national attention was directed to the small town of Bel Air. The pressure intensified. Harford County wasn't equipped for high-profile homicides. Their crime lab outsourced several samples to the Maryland State Police Forensic Sciences Division. The case was upgraded to a multi-agency task force. That included local detectives, FBI liaisons, and later Icefield agents, though at this point there was no federal jurisdiction, only coordination. Internally, investigators began to shift the narrative. With no personal motive evident and no match on DNA, they began considering Rachel's death as a potential stranger homicide, statistically rare, logistically difficult to solve, and socially terrifying. They reviewed other unsolved sexual assaults in Maryland from the past 18 months. No pattern emerged, but a break came from across the country. Los Angeles County submitted a bulletin referencing a March 2023 home invasion and sexual assault. The recovered DNA from that scene, uploaded months prior, now matched Rachel Morin's killer. The victim in Los Angeles had survived. She was attacked inside her home by an unknown male who had broken in through a rear sliding door. The MO was different, urban, residential, nighttime, but the DNA was identical. This wasn't just a killer. This was a mobile predator crossing state lines. What remained unclear was whether Rachel had been targeted or if she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Detectives couldn't find any shared digital connections between her and the LA victim. There was no common social media overlap, no shared travel patterns. But what this link did confirm, definitively, was that the killer had offended before, violently, and evaded capture. What stood out in both attacks: speed, silence, and absence of follow-up. The Los Angeles attacker had fled the scene before neighbors heard anything. In Rachel's case, he left no traceable trail, no stolen cards, no discarded items, no communication. The only thread between them was the blood he left behind. For the first time, the word serial was whispered among agents. Publicly, no such language was used. Press briefings remained measured. The sheriff's office called the case an ongoing homicide investigation with the full resources of federal and state agencies. Rachel's family, meanwhile, began posting regular updates on social media, pleading for help, hoping for witnesses. Her sister, Rebecca, spoke at a community vigil, emphasizing Rachel's role as a mother, not a statistic. The public response was strong, but so were the online rumors. The boyfriend was accused by some, despite his full cooperation. The ex-husband was mentioned. Conspiracy theories began circling online forums. Harford County law enforcement, aware of how cases had spiraled under public pressure in the past, chose to keep core details sealed. They released no crime scene photos, no autopsy data, no confirmation of sexual assault. They issued statements only after the CODIS hit with LA. What they didn't reveal, even internally, was their growing concern about something worse: the lack of digital trace on the suspect, no known alias, no identified vehicle, no paper trail. If this man had traveled across the country and murdered again without drawing attention, what else had he done? The investigation was moving forward, but so was the clock. The suspect's DNA had spoken clearly. It matched across two crime scenes, one in Maryland and one in Los Angeles. But beyond that, it said nothing. He had no record in any U.S. database. No arrest, no traffic citation, no documented job, no tax return, no fingerprint on file, no facial recognition hits from Maryland's DMV or California's gang files. He didn't exist in the system. That narrowed the profile to two possibilities: a ghost or a foreign national operating under a false identity. When law enforcement hits a wall like this, the next step is often immigration records. But even those depend on whether someone ever interacted with the system to begin with. In this case, ICE's enforcement and removal operations began combing through entry logs, recent deportees, and biometric traces from southern border apprehensions. The parameters were wide: males between 18 and 40, Central American origin, no confirmed legal presence, known to move between urban centers. The result was a list: dozens of names, aliases, suspected re-entries, none of them yet tied to Rachel Morin. To avoid triggering media chaos, these developments weren't shared publicly. Harford County released no new details after confirming the DNA link to California. They kept the suspect description generic: no sketches, no vehicle alerts. Internally, FBI behavioral analysis units were consulted to review the killer's movement pattern. Crossing the country to attack two victims with different profiles suggested either deep instability or tactical precision. Meanwhile, field agents began working backward from the LA case. There, the suspect had broken into a home through a sliding door, attacked a woman while she was alone, and vanished before police arrived. Security cameras on the block had captured a figure leaving the neighborhood on foot. That image was now being reanalyzed using enhanced contrast software in hopes of generating facial features. Nothing useful had emerged. If this suspect had entered the country illegally, which now seemed likely, it raised new urgency. There would be no driver's license to match, no prior address, and no way to know if he'd killed before. Worse, if he'd already left Maryland, the chance of another attack was not theoretical. It was probable. Federal analysts began tracing crimes in other states with similar forensic signatures. Cases that had gone cold or were marked as no suspect identified were pulled from storage. Any open rape or homicide involving DNA, but no match, became relevant. It was, for all intents, a net being cast without knowing where the fish had gone. Back in Maryland, investigators were re-evaluating the crime scene, not for what they had missed, but for what they had assumed. Initially, it was believed that Rachel had been followed in real time, but another theory was emerging. What if the suspect had already been on the trail, waiting? This would change everything. Officers reviewed parking lot surveillance again. No unfamiliar vehicles stood out, but not everyone arrived by car. Some walked in from side streets. Some used the back trail entrances, unmonitored, overgrown, or adjacent to residential fences. Several led to commercial dumpsters and abandoned structures. Search teams returned to those fringe zones, scanning with drones and canine units. No new evidence was found, but the fact remained: the killer hadn't left the trail through a visible route. He had slipped out just as cleanly as he had entered. Either he knew the terrain or had studied it. This kind of criminal behavior fits a narrow behavioral category. Offenders who strike across state lines and leave no trail are either transient by lifestyle or fugitives by necessity. The latter now seem more likely. A cross-check with Interpol red notices was issued, focusing on men from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala with violent criminal history. One name surfaced that stood out, not for being identified, but for having killed once before and vanished from his country of origin. That file would become pivotal, but at this stage it remained buried beneath a dozen other leads. At a press briefing that week, the sheriff stated, "We are exploring all possible connections, including national and international pathways. This is an active, complex investigation." Behind the podium, the atmosphere was tense. Journalists were pressing for updates. Online speculation had reached critical mass. Social media accounts with no ties to Rachel were claiming she had been stalked. Others circulated false suspect sketches. Internally, the FBI team issued a recommendation: do not disclose the killer's likely nationality or immigration status until confirmation. The risk of political backlash or vigilantism was too high. The goal was resolution, not escalation. What kept investigators grounded were the facts. DNA didn't lie. Rachel's death wasn't random. It was replicable. It was mobile. And it wasn't over. For Rachel's family, this phase of the investigation brought silence, both from authorities and from the person responsible. There was no manifesto, no taunting message, no claim. It was as if the killer had disappeared back into a shadow he knew how to navigate. But he hadn't disappeared, not yet. There was no formal trigger for the FBI to classify Rachel Morin's case as the work of a serial offender. There was no third crime yet, no manifesto, no letter to the press. But the behavioral flags were stacking up, quietly, methodically, and the language behind closed doors was shifting. The point of no return wasn't a new crime, it was a new connection. In mid-August, 3 weeks after Rachel's murder, analysts in Quantico began to cross-reference the offender's DNA profile against archived cases marked inactive or unsolved. One entry, previously flagged in Arizona, carried nearly identical biological markers from a sexual assault in a Phoenix storage facility. No known suspect. DNA collected. No match at the time. Now, flagged. The Phoenix victim had survived. She had reported a man breaking into her facility unit around closing time, assaulting her in the rear corridor, then fleeing on foot before officers arrived. He didn't steal anything. The act was fast, violent, and silent. No license plate, no cameras. And again, no known connection between victim and attacker. When her DNA sample was compared with the Maryland and California cases, the confirmation was immediate. The same male profile had been found at all 3 scenes, 3 states, 3 victims, 3 nearly silent disappearances into the urban noise. Law enforcement couldn't wait for public pressure to catch up. The profile had to change. This wasn't a local assault or a crime of passion. It was the early signature of a mobile offender, high risk, high escalation potential, with an unknown origin point. The Behavioral Analysis Unit issued a new internal classification: organized, violent, opportunistic predator. The timeline confirmed he wasn't transient in the traditional sense. He moved, but deliberately. The spacing between assaults, March in LA, possibly May in Arizona, and August in Maryland, was consistent with someone traveling under the radar, not homeless, not impulsive, calculated. Now they needed to find a pattern in that movement. Agents began compiling data from bus terminals, shelters, freight yards, and day labor networks. The suspect didn't show up in hotel logs, digital payments, or public housing registries. That ruled out most traceable accommodations. But one transit corridor kept surfacing in their models: the route north from Mexico through Texas, then eastward across I-10 and into the mid-Atlantic region. Dozens of unconfirmed border entries in early 2023 fit the time frame, but again, no name, no match. The manhunt now hinged on identifying not what the suspect left behind, but what he didn't. He used no vehicles registered in his name, no phones traced to his presence. He had avoided surveillance blind spots intuitively, and in each case, the location of the assault was either near public access points or areas with minimal oversight. In Phoenix, it was an industrial lot. In LA, a private home with poor visibility. In Bel Air, a trailhead with multiple exits and unmonitored wooded areas. These weren't random, they were selected. FBI analysts developed a risk matrix mapping potential future zones of attack based on public trail systems, low-income residential areas with weak security, and known undocumented population movement routes. This wasn't about blaming communities. It was about catching a man who had used them to disappear. Rachel's case remained the most violent. Hers was the only confirmed homicide. That made her death both unique and critical. It also meant she likely resisted. Hard. The medical examiner's report was revisited. A closer look revealed minor tissue tearing in the shoulder joint, likely from being pulled backward forcefully. Bruising across the rib cage indicated direct weight applied during restraint, and an unusual abrasion on her scalp was shaped like the corner edge of the culvert. That suggested she may have hit the concrete before being fully inside it. It was increasingly clear the killer didn't plan to leave a body visible. But something interrupted his sequence. Maybe a passerby nearby or movement in the trees. That may have limited his time. Or it may have just confirmed something investigators now feared. He didn't care. The difference between someone who conceals a crime and someone who doesn't is measurable. The former buys time. The latter sends a message. And what was left at Rachel's scene wasn't staged, but it also wasn't hidden well enough to avoid being found within a day. The theory was emerging that Rachel wasn't the first kill, but the first victim to become a known name. Outside the labs and agencies, Rachel's family continued their own efforts. A private investigator had been retained. Flyers were distributed across truck stops and Greyhound depots. Local news covered the family's campaign for national attention. But the suspect remained unidentified, and the only person who might have been able to describe him, the survivor in Arizona, had given a composite sketch too vague to be actionable. The lighting had been poor, the attack fast. Still, something in her description stuck. She remembered a scar under the left eye, faint but definite. That detail was added to the case file and quietly passed along to task forces in 5 states. It wasn't enough for a warrant, but it was enough to prompt a question in every room where a new suspect emerged. Does he have a scar? Back in Harford County, investigators were out of leads on the ground. The trail had gone quiet. Rachel's digital footprint offered nothing new. The killer hadn't used her phone, hadn't accessed her accounts, no credit cards taken, no suspicious logins. Clean. What couldn't be cleaned, though, was the data picture forming in federal servers, a timeline growing in scope and severity, centered around a man who left DNA and nothing else. The suspect's identity was still unknown, but his presence had finally become visible through the patterns of his violence. For nearly 10 months, the case stalled in public but moved behind the scenes. 3 confirmed attacks, 1 resulting in homicide, and a suspect still known only by a numerical DNA profile. No traceable identity, no digital footprint, no known origin. But the silence didn't mean absence, it meant discipline, and that never lasted forever. The break came from an address in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It wasn't tied to any known name in the case. The house didn't show up in federal watch lists, immigration red flags, or human trafficking investigations. It showed up because of a domestic disturbance call. A neighbor had reported hearing yelling and objects breaking in the unit next door. Officers were dispatched. It was routine, until one of them filed an internal note. He had seen a man flee the rear exit of the unit before backup arrived. The man didn't return. No one at the property claimed to know him, but the officer noticed something else. A backpack, abandoned in the alley. Inside there was no phone, no ID, but there were gloves, a change of clothes, and a small toiletry kit. The gloves were processed as standard procedure. DNA was lifted. A week later, the results came back. It was the same profile linked to Rachel Morin, the Los Angeles survivor in the Phoenix assault. The unknown male had been in Tulsa and had almost walked past local police again. That changed the trajectory of the case immediately. A task force was assembled with field agents from Tulsa PD, U.S. Marshals, FBI Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, and representatives from Maryland and California law enforcement. The goal wasn't to release information publicly. It was to contain the perimeter. Agents began canvassing apartment complexes within 5 miles of the incident. The man had to be sleeping somewhere. A facial composite wasn't available, but the one consistent detail, light scar beneath the left eye, was now included in all interviews. In addition, the man was believed to be in his 20s or early 30s, with lean build, short dark hair, and possibly Salvadoran or Guatemalan descent. Still no name. They worked through employers who paid cash, construction foremen, day labor pickup points, car washes, food prep staff at non-franchised restaurants. The composite wasn't helping, but patterns were. In each location, a man had worked briefly, then disappeared within a week, paid under the table, no social security, no paper trail. But one employer remembered more than most. A roofing supervisor said a man matching the description had worked 3 days before quitting midweek, claimed he was leaving town for a family emergency. The supervisor didn't have a phone number, but had written down an address for payroll purposes. It was an informal house share on the edge of Tulsa's city limits. Officers moved on it within hours. Quiet, no press. They waited for confirmation that the man was inside. Surveillance was set up. The property had 3 exits. All were watched. At 6:42 a.m. the next morning, a man emerged through the back carrying a trash bag and walking toward the adjacent lot. He wore a hoodie, head down, but the camera angle from the south perimeter captured his left profile. There was a faint mark under the eye. Agents confirmed the location and made the decision to engage. He was taken into custody without incident. No weapons were found on him. He gave a false name, common, Spanish-sounding, no ID. When fingerprinted, no match came up in any U.S. record. He was held under immigration violation protocols pending further processing. The bag he carried contained clothes, discarded gloves, and 2 razor blades. No phone, no wallet, nothing to tie him to anyone, but enough to warrant holding him. It was the DNA swab that confirmed the rest. It matched the sample from the Rachel Morin homicide. For the first time, the suspect had a face, but still not a legal name. It took 3 days cross-referencing regional law enforcement and foreign consulates to finally identify him. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez, Salvadoran national, 23 years old, known fugitive in El Salvador for the murder of a young woman in 2022, had entered the U.S. illegally in early 2023 through Texas, never apprehended at entry, no biometric entry logged, no asylum request, no detention. His name had existed in foreign homicide databases but hadn't yet synced with U.S. alerts due to delays in data sharing agreements. When interrogated, Victor did not speak. He did not deny, admit, or react. His public defender advised silence. No confession was obtained, but it didn't matter. The DNA matched across 3 states. The gloves in Tulsa placed him at the scene post-crime. Surveillance confirmed he'd been living under aliases, avoiding permanent locations, moving eastward with each job drop-off. There was no psychological analysis provided at this stage. His mental state was not evaluated. What mattered legally was the timeline and the forensic ties. He was extradited to Maryland under warrant for the murder of Rachel Morin. Charges for the other 2 assaults were deferred but documented federally. At a press briefing days later, officials finally confirmed what they had withheld for months. The man believed to have murdered Rachel Morin had been located and arrested. No further details were shared publicly about his immigration status or prior record. For Rachel's family, the announcement was both closure and a turning point. The suspect had been walking free for nearly a year. He had been one step ahead of the system at every turn, until he made a mistake. A trash bag, a pair of gloves, a visible scar. It didn't take a major sting operation or advanced tracking software. It took an officer who wrote down what he saw and followed through. And that, more than any surveillance grid or criminal database, was what finally brought Rachel's killer into view. The Harford County Circuit Court courtroom wasn't large, but it held more weight than most halls in the state that summer. After 10 months of multi-state coordination, silent surveillance, and lab reports, the case of State of Maryland v. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez went to trial under intense scrutiny from both the public and law enforcement communities. Victor was charged with the murder, rape, and kidnapping of Rachel Morin. He sat silently beside his court-appointed counsel. No media statements, no confession, just a man whose identity had only surfaced because he made one mistake in Tulsa, leaving behind gloves with biological evidence. The prosecution came prepared. They avoided dramatics. Instead, they followed a linear forensic strategy, establishing presence, proving violence, and tying both to the defendant through evidence beyond dispute. Crime scene analysts reconstructed the attack with precise detail. Jurors saw maps of the Ma and Pa trail, learned where Rachel's body had been discovered, how her attacker had likely dragged her into the culvert, and where trace materials, blood, semen, epithelial cells, had been recovered. Forensic teams explained how DNA collected from her body matched that of the gloves recovered in Oklahoma. and the previous sexual assaults in California and Arizona. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull inflicted by a heavy object. A rock found near the body bore traces of Rachel's blood and hair, and biological residue that genetically matched Victor. Chain of custody logs were introduced in court to eliminate any defense claims of contamination or cross-handling. The defense challenged procedure, not evidence. They questioned the timeline, raised hypotheticals, and suggested the possibility of a second unknown contributor. But the DNA data from 3 independent laboratories, along with the untouched chain of custody, rendered those arguments ineffective. Every forensic link pointed back to the same man. Rachel's sister Rebecca was called briefly. Her role wasn't to humanize Rachel but to confirm behavioral patterns: when Rachel went out, when she usually came home, and what triggered concern that night. She recounted when the texts stopped, when the phone calls went unanswered, and how the silence started to take form. 9 days into trial, closing arguments began. The prosecution refrained from speculation. No motive was offered, only sequence, data, and physical evidence. They told the jury, motive isn't a requirement, presence and violence are, and both were proven. The jury returned with a unanimous guilty verdict after 47 minutes. Convicted on all counts, Victor Martinez Hernandez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He did not react. But outside the courtroom, the reactions were far from quiet. Rachel's family released no emotional statement. Instead, they sent written communication to state officials and law enforcement agencies. Their message was not a plea for punishment. It was a demand for review. Victor had crossed into the U.S. illegally through the southern border in early 2023. Records confirmed he had murdered a woman in El Salvador months prior. That information never reached U.S. authorities. There had been no active red notice from Interpol in time, no biometric registration at the point of entry, no background screening. When he attacked in Los Angeles and left DNA behind, it went unclaimed. The same happened in Arizona. He had moved east, leaving behind biological fingerprints, but no identity. His face wasn't in any system. His name had never appeared on a watch list. He worked cash jobs, used informal housing, and disappeared before anyone could document him. He was caught only because a local police officer logged an alleyway bag that looked out of place. Rachel's family asked for answers, not just about how he got in, but why every trace of him was ignored until it was too late. They pushed for changes in how violent fugitives from foreign nations are flagged in U.S. systems. They proposed more aggressive integration between forensic databases and immigration screenings. They wanted accountability, not for politics, but because their sister was dead, and she didn't have to be. The Department of Homeland Security offered no official response. No agency claimed responsibility for the lapses in coordination, but quietly, internal audits began. In Bel Air, community routines changed. Trail traffic dropped. Security cameras were installed near public paths, even when funding hadn't yet been approved. Local stores began stocking pepper spray and small tactical lights at checkout counters. Not because of fear, but because the illusion of safety had been broken in the most permanent way. The culvert where Rachel's body had been found was not demolished. It remained exactly where it was. No memorial plaque, no flowers, just a sealed pipe, a faded patch of earth, and a reminder that some crimes happen without warning, even in places where people don't lock their doors. What lingered after the verdict wasn't just closure. It was the understanding that a man had slipped through nearly every level of national protection, not because the system didn't work, but because the systems didn't talk to each other. Law enforcement had done their job, forensics had done theirs, but none of it mattered until someone noticed a trash bag in an alley and logged it. Rachel Morin was murdered in August of 2023. Her killer wasn't caught until the summer of 2024. He had passed through multiple states, multiple victims, and multiple opportunities to be stopped. None of them succeeded until the last one did. And that, more than the verdict, was what her family would remember. The trial was over. The sentence was final. The cameras moved on. But silence didn't mean healing. For Rachel Morin's family, there was no post-verdict relief, only the slow, unfamiliar adjustment to absence. There were 5 children now being raised without their mother. Legal guardianship had been awarded to Rachel's ex-husband, who remained largely out of the public eye. The children did not speak to the media. Their names were never mentioned in court. Inside the home Rachel had once managed alone, photographs remained, school papers, birthday decorations. pieces of a routine life interrupted by violence. Her family, careful not to become political symbols, returned to private grief after the verdict. There were no lawsuits, no protests, just a recurring question that resurfaced in private. How did no one stop him sooner? That question was never answered officially. Victor Martinez Hernandez had been in the United States for approximately 17 months before he was apprehended. In that time, he had crossed at least 5 state lines. He had worked, lived, and moved without notice. The forensic trail had existed, but the information scattered across agencies, jurisdictions, and disconnected systems had never aligned fast enough to intercept him before Rachel's murder. The silence that followed was institutional as well as personal. Post-conviction, Rachel's case was used in 2 internal reviews within federal law enforcement agencies. One focused on biometric entry failures, why Victor hadn't been flagged at the southern border. The other examined the interoperability between criminal databases and immigration enforcement. Findings from both were classified and not made public. There were no official changes to national protocol, but law enforcement in Harford County received updated guidance on how to escalate potential federal interest cases earlier. Cross-state DNA matches would now trigger automatic alerts in cases involving violent crimes. It was something. It wasn't enough. For the public, the story faded quickly. Rachel Morin's name appeared briefly in year-end summaries of violent crimes, but was soon eclipsed by newer headlines. Some true crime forums continued discussing the timeline, the digital gaps, and the legal technicalities. But for most, the case had closed the day Victor was sentenced. What remained was the reality that justice had not been proactive. It had been reactive, relying not on prevention, but on the accumulation of evidence after the damage was done. Bel Air never formally memorialized Rachel. There was no public statue, no trailhead ceremony, but her family created a quiet tribute, a community cleanup program named Rachel's Walks, focused on making walking trails safer through patrols, lighting checks, and anonymous reporting tools. It wasn't advertised, it was local, small-scale, and consistent. In her final weeks alive, Rachel hadn't posted much online. Her last public post was a photo. It showed her on the trail, wearing headphones, smiling mid-step. The caption was simple, "I don't need loud to feel strong." Her family later said they chose not to delete the post. They left it visible, not for attention, but as a marker of what mattered before the narrative changed. Before every mention of her name was paired with the word murder, the man who killed Rachel was sentenced and imprisoned. But the silence that followed didn't belong to him. It belonged to the space where she should have still existed. Some stories don't end in the courtroom. They echo in every policy that fails to protect, in every silence that costs a life. What happened to Rachel reminds us that justice isn't just about catching the guilty. It's about noticing what we ignored too long. As someone who's followed this case from start to finish, if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You don't need to be loud to make a difference, but you do need to act when it matters. What about you? Do you believe our systems are doing enough to keep people safe, or are we just getting better at responding too late? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, or what stuck with you the most in Rachel's story. And if this video reached your heart or made you think, please consider subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next story, and we can keep having these conversations that matter.